They had been warned Texas was a barren wasteland of outlaws and desert heat, but when German prisoners stepped off the trains in 1943, what they found shattered every lie they had been told about the American South. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Imagine being a young soldier, barely past 20, captured in the sand dunes of Tunisia after weeks of brutal combat. You've heard stories whispered in the barracks back in Germany, stories of Texas as a lawless frontier where men shoot first and ask questions later, where the sun bakes everything into dust, and where prisoners would be worked to death under a merciless sky. For thousands of German soldiers captured during the North African campaign, these fears gnawed at them as they were loaded onto transport ships bound for America. The year was 1943. Field Marshal Rommel's Africa Corps had crumbled under relentless Allied pressure. German and Italian forces surrendered by the thousands, their uniforms caked with desert sand, their bodies exhausted from months of fighting in impossible conditions. For these men, the war seemed finished. But a new kind of uncertainty loomed: captivity in a land they had been taught to fear and despise. Nazi propaganda had painted vivid, terrifying pictures of America. Posters showed images of violent cowboys, corrupt lawmen, and chaotic cities ruled by gangsters. Texas, in particular, was portrayed as the embodiment of American savagery, a place where civilization had never truly taken root, where justice came from the barrel of a gun, and where the weak perished under the burning sun. To young soldiers raised on these stories, being shipped to Texas felt like being sentenced to hell itself. The journey began in the cramped, temporary holding camps of North Africa. Wolfgang, a 23-year-old infantryman from Hamburg, Germany, remembered the gnawing dread that filled those final days before departure. He wrote in his journal, "We traded rumors like currency. Some said we'd be sent to labor camps in the desert. Others whispered we'd be executed quietly, far from witnesses. No one knew the truth, and that made it worse." When the orders came, the prisoners were herded onto trucks under armed guard. The Allied soldiers were professional but distant, their faces revealing nothing. The Germans were marched to the ports, where massive Liberty ships waited, vessels designed to haul cargo, not human beings. But now, these ships would carry thousands of prisoners across the Atlantic to an uncertain fate. Below deck, conditions were harsh. Hundreds of men were packed into tight rows, stripped of their weapons and most of their personal belongings. The air grew thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, seawater, and diesel fuel. Guards stood above with rifles ready, but there was little trouble. Most prisoners were too exhausted, too hungry, and too afraid to cause problems. Franz, a former tank commander from Stuttgart, recalled the Atlantic crossing with a mixture of dread and dark humor. The ship rolled constantly. Half the men were seasick within the first day. We joked that the Americans were trying to kill us with nausea before we even reached land. But beneath the jokes, we were terrified. Every man wondered what awaited us on the other side. The voyage was dangerous for everyone aboard. German U-boats still prowled the Atlantic, hunting Allied convoys. The irony was bitter. German prisoners feared being sunk by their own navy. At night, when the engines groaned and the convoy zigzagged to avoid torpedo strikes, silence fell over the holds. Every creak of the hull sounded like a death sentence. Yet, amid the fear, small moments chipped away at their expectations. The food, though simple, was more than they had eaten during the final weeks in Africa. Guards distributed bread, soup, and occasionally coffee. It wasn't luxury, but it was regular and filling. Some prisoners noticed that the American sailors, despite their stern expressions, never struck them or cursed them. One sailor, when asked by a prisoner why they were being fed so well, simply shrugged and said, "You're prisoners, not dogs." That single exchange stayed with many of them. Wolfgang wrote about it later. "For the first time, I wondered if what we had been told about Americans was true. If they were truly cruel, why feed us? Why treat us like men? After merely 2 weeks at sea, the cry finally went up, "Land!" The prisoners surged toward the hatches, desperate for a glimpse of America. When the coast came into view, it was nothing like they had imagined. Instead of ruins or desolation, they saw a bustling harbor filled with ships, cranes, and endless rows of warehouses. The docks were alive with activity, trucks moving in perfect order, workers shouting instructions, and cargo being loaded and unloaded with military precision. But this was only the first American port. The real journey was just beginning. After disembarking, the prisoners were loaded onto trains, long, rattling freight cars refitted with benches and barred windows. Guards stood at each door, rifles slung casually over their shoulders. The prisoners watched through the windows as the American landscape began to unfold. At first, they saw the industrial East Coast, factories belching smoke, crowded cities and roads packed with automobiles. It was impressive, but not entirely unexpected. What shocked them came later. As the trains pushed westward and southward, the landscape changed dramatically. Forests gave way to open plains. Small towns appeared, each one neat and orderly, with white-painted houses and paved streets. Children waved from the side of the tracks, curious but unafraid. Then came the farmland. Endless fields of wheat, corn, and cotton stretching toward the horizon. Cattle grazed in pastures so large they seemed to go on forever. Barns stood tall and freshly painted. Silos rose like monuments to abundance. For men who had left behind a Europe ravaged by bombing and starvation, the sight was almost incomprehensible. Franz pressed his face against the window, his breath fogging the glass. "Look at this," he muttered to Wolfgang beside him. "There is no war here. It's as if they live on another planet." Wolfgang nodded slowly, unable to tear his eyes away from the passing landscape. If this is what they can do while fighting a war on 2 continents, then how did we ever think we could win? The question hung in the air, unanswered. As the trains rolled deeper into the south, the heat began to rise. The air grew thick and humid, pressing against the prisoners like a wet blanket. They had expected heat. Texas was supposed to be a desert after all. But this was different. This was wet heat, clinging and oppressive, unlike anything they had experienced in North Africa. Then, finally, the announcement came. Next stop, Texas. The prisoners exchanged nervous glances. This was it. The moment they had dreaded since their capture. The train slowed, brakes screeching as they pulled into a small station surrounded by flat, open land. Guards barked orders, and the prisoners filed out onto the platform, blinking in the bright sunlight. What they saw stopped them in their tracks. Texas was not a barren wasteland. It was not a desert filled with sand and tumbleweeds. Instead, they found themselves standing in a landscape of shocking green. Vast fields of cotton stretching endlessly under a sky so wide and blue it seemed unreal. Trees lined the horizon, their leaves rustling in a warm breeze. In the distance, farmhouses stood surrounded by gardens and livestock. The air smelled of earth, grass, and something sweet they couldn't identify. Wolfgang stared, his mouth slightly open. "This is Texas?" A guard nearby, overhearing him, chuckled. "What did you expect, son? Cactus and rattlesnakes?" The prisoners didn't answer. They couldn't. Everything they had been told was a lie. They were loaded onto trucks and driven to the camps, sprawling complexes of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. But even here the surprises continued. The camps were orderly, clean, and organized. Barracks had roofs that didn't leak. There were latrines, showers, and even small gardens where vegetables grew. The smell of cooking food drifted from the mess halls. When the prisoners lined up for their first meal, they braced themselves for stale bread and thin gruel. Instead, they were handed trays loaded with beef stew, mashed potatoes, cornbread, and coffee. Real coffee. Hot, dark, and strong. Franz stared at his tray in disbelief. Is this a trick? An American cook, wiping his hands on his apron, overheard and grinned. No trick, buddy. Geneva Convention says you eat what we eat. Enjoy. The prisoners sat in silence, eating slowly, savoring every bite. Some wept quietly, overwhelmed by the simple act of being fed like human beings. Others simply stared at their plates, struggling to reconcile this reality with the nightmares they had been promised. That night, lying on his bunk in the barracks, Wolfgang stared at the ceiling. Around him, men whispered in the darkness, sharing their disbelief. Did you see the farms? The cattle? The crops? It's like they have no limits. And the food? Real meat. Bread that isn't moldy. Coffee. Maybe it won't last, Franz said quietly. Maybe this is just for show. But deep down, even he didn't believe that anymore. As the days passed, the prisoners began to settle into a rhythm. They woke to roll call, worked in the fields or around the camp, and returned each evening to meals that never seemed to run out. The guards were firm but fair. There were no beatings, no starvation, no cruelty. Just order, routine, and an abundance that felt almost obscene to men who had watched their homeland crumble. But Texas had more surprises in store, and as the prisoners ventured beyond the barbed wire to work on local farms, they would discover a world even stranger and more contradictory than they could have imagined. The wire fences stood tall, but they no longer felt like walls. They felt like borders to a world the prisoners were only beginning to understand. And in the fields of Texas, under that impossibly wide sky, everything they thought they knew about America and about themselves was about to be tested. The morning sun rose over the Texas camp with a heat that pressed down like a physical weight, thick and suffocating even in the early hours. Wolfgang woke to the sound of whistles piercing the dawn silence and the shuffle of boots on wooden floors that creaked with each step. Around him, men stirred from their bunks, rubbing sleep from their eyes with calloused hands and pulling on their work clothes, faded shirts and trousers that had seen better days. The routine had become familiar over the past few weeks. Roll call at 6 sharp, breakfast of strong coffee and oatmeal, then assignment to work details that would take them beyond the wire and into the vast Texas countryside. Today, Wolfgang and Franz were assigned to a cotton farm 15 miles south of the camp. They climbed onto the back of a flatbed truck with 20 other prisoners, their bodies pressed together in the confined space, guarded by 2 American soldiers who seemed barely older than teenagers, their uniforms still crisp and new. The truck rumbled down dirt roads, its engine coughing and sputtering, kicking up clouds of dust that coated everything in a fine layer of Texas earth, their clothes, their skin, even their teeth when they opened their mouths to speak. Through the truck's wooden slats, Wolfgang watched the landscape roll past like frames in a film. They passed small towns with main streets lined with shops, hardware stores displaying tools in their windows, diners with neon signs advertising breakfast specials, and pharmacies with bright painted signs promising remedies for every ailment. Women in cotton dresses pushed baby carriages along sidewalks, stopping occasionally to chat with neighbors. Children played in front yards, their laughter carrying on the breeze, tossing balls and chasing each other in games that knew no boundaries. It was a vision of normalcy, of life continuing undisturbed that seemed impossible for men who had left behind cities reduced to rubble and ash. The farm they arrived at belonged to a man named Thomas Brennan, a weathered rancher in his 50s with skin tanned dark brown from decades under the sun, hands like leather, and eyes that squinted against the constant glare. He stood waiting as the truck pulled up, arms crossed over his chest, a toothpick dangling from the corner of his mouth, watching the Germans file out with an expression that revealed nothing, neither hostility nor welcome. "You men ever picked cotton before?" Brennan asked, his Texas drawl thick and slow, each word stretched out like taffy. The prisoners exchanged glances, looking at each other with uncertainty. Most shook their heads. In Germany, they had been soldiers, factory workers, clerks, not farmhands. Brennan sighed, a long exhale that spoke of resignation. "Figures. Well, you're about to learn. Follow me." He led them into the fields, where rows of cotton plants stretched toward the horizon in perfectly straight lines, their white bowls bursting open like small clouds attached to green stems that swayed gently in the morning breeze. Brennan demonstrated the technique with practiced ease, grasping the cotton firmly with thumb and forefinger, pulling it from the bowl without damaging the plant, and dropping it into the long canvas sack draped over the shoulder that would grow heavier with each passing hour. "Keep your rows straight," he instructed, his voice carrying across the field. "Don't mix trash with the cotton. No leaves, no stems, and drink water when you need it. There's barrels at the end of each row. I don't need anyone passing out on my property and causing me paperwork." The work was back-breaking in ways Wolfgang hadn't anticipated. The prisoners bent double, their spines curved at unnatural angles, moving slowly down the endless rows under a sun that climbed higher and hotter with each passing hour, beating down with relentless intensity. Wolfgang's fingers grew raw from the sharp edges of the cotton bowls, tiny cuts opening up across his fingertips and palms. His back screamed in protest, muscles he didn't know he had, crying out for relief. Sweat soaked through his shirt within the first hour, leaving dark patches across his chest and back. But what struck him most was not the difficulty of the work, it was the strange civility of it all. Brennan moved through the fields periodically, checking on the prisoner's progress with a critical eye, offering corrections, but never shouting, never raising his voice in anger. Around midday, when the sun reached its zenith and the heat became nearly unbearable, his wife appeared with a wagon pulled by an old mule loaded with large ceramic jugs of sweet tea beaded with condensation and sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. She was a small woman with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a simple house dress and an apron, and she handed out food without ceremony or comment, treating the German prisoners no differently than she might have treated hired help. Franz took his sandwich with trembling hands, staring at it as though it might vanish like a mirage. "Real meat," he whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "Ham and cheese, and the bread is white, Wolfgang. White bread." "Don't just stare at it," Wolfgang muttered, his own stomach growling. "Eat before they change their minds." They sat in the shade of the wagon, grateful for the brief respite from the sun, eating in silence while Brennan's wife poured tea into tin cups, the ice clinking against the metal. The sandwich was simple but substantial: thick slices of ham, a slab of yellow cheese, fresh lettuce, and mustard on bread that was soft and fresh. Wolfgang couldn't remember the last time he had eaten so well. When she reached Wolfgang, she paused, studying his face for a moment with eyes that seemed to see past his prisoner's uniform to the person beneath. "You got people back home?" she asked quietly, her voice gentle. Wolfgang looked up, surprised by the personal question. "Yes, ma'am, in Hamburg, my mother and sister." She nodded slowly, her expression softening. "I pray they're safe. War's hard on everyone. Don't matter which side you're on." The simple kindness in her voice, the genuine concern for the well-being of people she had never met and who belonged to a nation at war with her own, hit Wolfgang harder than any propaganda speech ever had. He managed to quiet, "Thank you, ma'am," before she moved on to the next prisoner. That evening, when the truck returned them to camp, bouncing over the rough roads as the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Wolfgang and Franz walked in silence toward the barracks, each lost in his own thoughts. Finally, Franz spoke. "The farmer's wife asked about my family," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "She wanted to know if they were safe. She didn't have to do that. We're the enemy. We're Germans who shot at American boys." Wolfgang nodded, understanding the confusion in his friend's voice. "I know. So why does she care? Why would she care about us?" Wolfgang had no answer. It was a question that would haunt him for weeks to come. As weeks turned into months, the rhythm of camp life became deeply familiar, settling into a pattern that felt almost normal. The prisoners were assigned to various work details depending on the season and local needs. Some picked cotton until their fingers bled. Others harvested pecans from groves that seemed to go on forever, or worked in lumber mills where the scream of saws filled the air. A few were sent to help build roads or repair bridges damaged by floods, working alongside American contractors who treated them with professional courtesy. The work was hard and demanding, but it was honest labor, and the prisoners were paid small allowances, 50 cents a day, that they could spend at the camp canteen on cigarettes, writing paper, or sweets that reminded them of home. In the evenings, when the work was done and the prisoners had washed the day's dirt from their skin, the camp came alive with unexpected activity. A group of prisoners formed a soccer team, marking out a field near the barracks with lime powder and playing matches that drew crowds of cheering spectators who shouted encouragement and jeered good-naturedly at missed goals. Others discovered musical instruments stored in a supply shed, a violin with 2 broken strings, a clarinet that needed new reeds, a battered guitar with a crack down its back, and began holding impromptu concerts that filled the Texas twilight with German folk songs, the melodies drifting across the camp and stirring memories of home. Dieter, a former art student from Berlin with clever hands and an artist's eye, spent his evenings sketching portraits of fellow prisoners and landscapes of the Texas countryside on whatever paper he could find. His drawings captured the strange duality of their existence, men behind barbed wire, but men who laughed, worked, and dreamed nonetheless. He drew the guard towers silhouetted against sunset skies, prisoners playing cards on their bunks, the endless Texas horizon that spoke of freedom just beyond reach. But not everyone embraced this strange new reality. In one corner of the barracks, a group led by a man named Conrad maintained fierce loyalty to the Nazi cause with the fervor of true believers. Conrad had been an SS officer, a true believer who still wore the invisible uniform of his ideology even in captivity, his back straight and his jaw set with determination. He organized secret meetings after lights out, demanding that prisoners maintain discipline and remember their duty to the fatherland, speaking in harsh whispers about honor and loyalty. "Don't let them fool you," Conrad hissed one night, his voice low but intense, his eyes burning with conviction in the darkness. "This comfort, this kindness is a trap designed to weaken us. They want to make us soft, make us forget who we are and what we fight for. But Germany will rise again, and when it does, those who betrayed their brothers will be remembered and punished." Wolfgang, lying on his bunk nearby, felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard these speeches before, had once believed them himself, but they rang hollow now. He thought of Brennan's wife asking about his family with genuine concern. He thought of the abundance he saw everywhere, fields overflowing with crops that fed millions, stores stocked with goods of every kind, children playing without fear of bombs falling from the sky. "Germany is losing the war," Wolfgang said quietly, breaking the silence that had fallen after Conrad's speech. Conrad's head snapped toward him, his face twisted with anger. "What did you say?" Wolfgang sat up on his bunk, meeting Conrad's glare. "You heard me. Germany is losing. We all know it if we're honest with ourselves. The only question is when it ends and how much more destruction there will be.
I dare to speak the truth, Wolfgang interrupted, his voice growing stronger, fueled by months of suppressed thoughts. Look around you, Conrad. We're eating better here than our families are eating in Germany. We have real meat, fresh bread, vegetables. We work hard, yes, but we're treated fairly and paid for our labor. Meanwhile, our cities are being bombed to dust. Hamburg, Berlin, Dresden, all of them burning. Tell me, if Germany is so strong, if the Führer is so brilliant, why are we here? Why did we surrender in Africa? Why are American and British soldiers fighting through France? The barracks fell silent, the air thick with tension. Men on nearby bunks listened intently, some nodding slightly in agreement, others looking away uncomfortable with the confrontation. Conrad's face darkened with rage, his hands clenching into fists. "You're a traitor to everything we fought for." "No," Wolfgang said calmly, his voice steady. "I'm just tired of lies. I'm tired of propaganda. I'm tired of blind faith in leaders who sent us to die for nothing." The tension simmered for days after that confrontation, creating an uncomfortable divide in the barracks. The camp remained split, those like Conrad, who clung to old beliefs with desperate intensity, and those like Wolfgang, who had begun to question everything they'd been taught, everything they'd once accepted as truth. But outside the wire, something else was happening that would change perceptions on both sides. The local Texans, initially wary of the German prisoners and uncertain about having enemy soldiers in their midst, were beginning to see them differently. Stories spread through the small towns like wildfire. Stories of prisoners who worked hard without complaint, who thanked farmers for their meals with genuine gratitude, who carved small wooden toys for local children using scrap lumber. When a tornado tore through a nearby town, damaging a church that had stood for 70 years, a group of prisoners volunteered to help rebuild it, working alongside local men to raise new walls and repair the roof. Their labor offered freely, without expectation of reward. One afternoon, while working at Brennan's farm during the autumn harvest, Wolfgang noticed a young girl watching from the porch of the farmhouse. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, with blonde braids tied with blue ribbons and a sundress covered in faded flowers. She held a rag doll tightly against her chest, her eyes wide with curiosity as she observed the German prisoners working in the fields. Wolfgang waved tentatively, uncertain how she'd respond. The girl ducked behind a post quickly, then slowly peered out again, her natural curiosity overcoming her shyness. This time, Wolfgang smiled warmly. After a moment's hesitation, the girl waved back, a small gesture that spoke volumes. That small gesture, a child's wave across a cotton field, stayed with Wolfgang for weeks, returning to his mind during long work days and quiet evenings. It was proof that beneath all the propaganda, all the manufactured hatred, all the fear drummed into people by governments and newspapers, people were simply people. And enemies could become, if not friends, then at least human beings in each other's eyes, capable of simple kindness. But the camp also held darker truths that the prisoners couldn't ignore, realities that complicated their understanding of America even further. One day, while being transported through a nearby town for a work assignment, the truck stopped at an intersection to let traffic pass. Wolfgang saw something that made his stomach turn with confusion and discomfort. A group of black Americans stood waiting at a bus stop, dressed neatly in work clothes, but when the bus arrived with a screech of brakes, they were forced to board through the back door and sit in the rear seats, separated by an invisible but absolute line. Meanwhile, white passengers entered through the front door without a second thought, taking their seats in the forward section as though this arrangement was the most natural thing in the world. Later that week, working in the fields alongside local laborers hired to supplement the prisoner workforce, the Germans noticed something that troubled them deeply. The black workers ate separately during lunch breaks, sitting under a different tree far from the white workers. They used different water buckets, drank from different ladles, and Wolfgang learned from overhearing conversations that they were paid significantly less for performing the exact same back-breaking labor under the same merciless sun. Friends, watching this division with growing confusion and disbelief, turned to Wolfgang during a water break. "I don't understand any of this," he said, his voice low. "We're prisoners. We're Germans who fought against them, who killed American soldiers in battle, but we eat in their restaurants when we go to town, drink from their fountains without anyone stopping us, sit wherever we want on trucks. Those men are Americans, born and raised here. They wear the same uniform when they serve, fight in the same army, yet they're treated worse than us. How does that make any sense?" Wolfgang had no answer. The contradiction was stark and deeply unsettling, challenging everything he thought he understood about America and its promises of freedom and equality. One evening, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, a black laborer named William came to deliver water to the prisoners working late in the fields to finish the day's quota. He was an older man, perhaps 60, with gray hair that curled tightly against his scalp and hands deeply scarred from decades of hard labor that had begun when he was barely old enough to walk. As he poured water into their cups with steady, practiced movements, Dieter, who had been watching the racial divisions with an artist's observant eye, asked him quietly, "Why do they treat you this way? You're American. This is your country." William looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable, weighing whether to answer this German prisoner's question honestly. Finally, he said, his voice tired but without bitterness, "Been asking that question my whole life, son. Still waiting for an answer that makes sense. My daddy asked it. His daddy before him asked it. Maybe my grandson will get an answer someday." The prisoners fell silent, the weight of William's words settling over them like a heavy blanket. For men who had been raised on Nazi propaganda about racial superiority and the supposed inferiority of other races, witnessing America's own racial divisions firsthand was deeply disturbing, not because it validated their former beliefs, but because it revealed the terrible complexity of the world and the human capacity for contradiction. Evil wasn't simple or confined to one nation. Justice wasn't clear or easily defined. And every country, it seemed, carried its own sins, its own blind spots, its own failures to live up to its highest ideals. That night, back in the barracks as men prepared for sleep, Wolfgang lay awake on his thin mattress, staring at the ceiling and thinking about William's words. He thought about the contradictions of Texas that he witnessed daily, the abundance and the segregation existing side by side, the kindness and the injustice intertwined, the wide-open skies that promised freedom, and the invisible walls that divided people by the color of their skin as effectively as any prison fence. "Wolfgang," he whispered into the darkness, knowing his friend was in the bunk beside him. "Are you awake?" "Yes," came the reply, equally quiet. "What do you think it all means? Everything we've seen here, the kindness, the cruelty, the contradictions." Franz was quiet for a long time, thinking carefully before he spoke. "I think," he finally said, his voice thoughtful, "that the world is far more complicated than anyone ever told us. And I think that maybe propaganda exists everywhere, not just in Germany. Maybe every country tells itself stories to justify what it does, to explain away its failings, to make its people feel righteous, even when they're not." Wolfgang nodded in the darkness, though Franz couldn't see him. It was a truth he was only beginning to understand, a realization that was both liberating and frightening. As autumn arrived in earnest, the Texas heat began to ease, replaced by cooler temperatures that made the work more bearable. The cotton harvest ended, the fields stripped clean of their white bolls, and prisoners were reassigned to other tasks, clearing land for new planting, repairing fences damaged by wandering cattle, helping with the pecan harvest that required climbing tall trees and shaking branches until the nuts rained down. The routine continued, day after day, week after week, while far across the ocean, the war ground relentlessly. News filtered into the camp slowly, usually through guards, who sometimes shared newspapers,
or from radio broadcasts the prisoners were occasionally allowed to hear. The reports were always weeks old by the time they reached the camp, but they painted an increasingly clear picture. Germany was being pushed back on all fronts. Cities were falling one by one. The Eastern Front was collapsing under the Soviet advance. Allied and British forces were driving deeper into German territory.
In the barracks, the mood shifted noticeably with each new report. Some men, like Conrad and his dwindling group of loyalists, refused to believe the reports, insisting loudly they were nothing but Allied propaganda designed to break their spirits. Others, like Wolfgang and Franz, and a growing number of prisoners, felt a strange mixture of relief and grief that was difficult to articulate. Relief that the war might soon end and the killing would stop. Grief for what that ending would mean for their homeland, for the destruction already wrought, for the uncertain future that awaited them. One cold December evening, as frost began to form on the barracks windows, Dieter approached Wolfgang with something hidden in his hands. He revealed the small wooden carving he had made during his free hours, a detailed replica of a Texas longhorn cow, complete with wide horns and expressive eyes, the wood smooth and warm from hours of patient work. "For you," Dieter said simply, pressing it into Wolfgang's hands. "So you remember." Wolfgang turned the carving over in his hands, feeling the smooth wood against his palms, admiring the incredible craftsmanship and attention to detail. "Remember what?" "That even in captivity we remained human," Dieter said, his voice soft but firm. "That even as prisoners we found beauty and created things, that enemies can share bread and sunsets and music and still be men. That we didn't let them, or ourselves, turn us into something less than what we are." Wolfgang clutched the carving tightly, feeling emotion rise in his throat. "Thank you, my friend. I'll treasure this always." As Christmas approached, something unexpected happened that would become one of Wolfgang's most cherished memories. Local churches, led by pastors who preached about loving one's enemies, organized a donation drive for the POW camp. Packages began arriving by truckload, filled with warm clothes to combat the Texas winter, books in German and English, musical instruments in better condition than the battered ones they'd found, and even Christmas decorations, strings of lights, paper stars, and small evergreen wreaths. On Christmas Eve, the camp commander, a reasonable man named Colonel Morrison, allowed the prisoners to hold a small celebration in the mess hall, which they decorated with the donated items until it looked almost festive. They sang German carols as darkness fell, Stille Nacht echoing through the Texas night, the familiar melody transporting them home for a few precious moments. Some men wept openly, overcome by memories of home and family, of Christmases past when the world made sense. Others simply closed their eyes and let the music wash over them, finding solace in the shared experience. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.